The movie's fast-paced action more than lived up to its moniker. What happens when an undercover police officer tracks you down after you're discovered in the criminal underworld? Do you believe you can avoid being apprehended? Not if you are as smart as Dominic in the film. You'll learn what happens to Dominic and his colleagues as we move forward. Relax and take pleasure. In the dockyard where the film is set, a container is being loaded onto a semi-trailer. The truck then drives away from the dockyard, and a dock worker calls an unidentified person on the other end to give them information about how to identify the truck. 3 similar black Honda Civic coupes with green neon swiftly approach the truck from behind. They move in an aggressive formation as they approach the truck. A hijacker wearing a motocross helmet emerges from the leading Civic's sunroof. He fires through the truck's left side windshield, breaking the glass, and then follows up by shooting into the passenger seat, where he manages to secure himself to the vehicle. The truck driver attempts to stop the hijacker with a baseball bat as he jumps from the Civic to the Semi and enters the cab. The hijacker then uses a tranquilizer dart to subdue the driver, seizing control of the truck in the process. The following day, Brian O'Connor is testing out his Mitsubishi Eclipse in the parking lot at Dodger Stadium. He is able to complete a test quarter mile at a top speed of 140 miles per hour, almost losing control of his car in the process. He leaves the stadium in frustration. He drives his work truck, a Ford F-150 SVT Lightning, to Toretto's Market and Cafe after his test drive, sits down at the counter inside, and gets a tuna fish sandwich. Given how irritated Brian was after the drive, getting a tuna sandwich wouldn't be a bad idea. While his food is being prepared, he takes notice of Dominic Toretto in the back. As Brian eats his lunch, a team of imported street racers arrives at the shop, all friends of Dominic and Mia, the shop's proprietors. Vince is aggravated that Brian is still coming around the store and instigates a fight with Brian, which Dominic is forced to break up. Dominic warns Brian not to come around the store again and reprimands Vince for starting the fight. Who treats a customer badly for coming to his or her store just to have a drink? Instigating a fight is never a good idea, but I guess Vince is bothered by Brian's frequent appearances at the store. But is Brian an undercover cop trying to find out what activity goes on at the store? Brian goes back to work at the Racer's Edge, a local retailer of performance parts, where he also leases a room in the rear. He lets Harry, his boss, know that he needs a nitrogen system put in his Eclipse by that evening. After dusk, a sizable gathering of street racers starts to develop on a side street, and Brian eventually shows up. Hector, one of the legends, notices Brian's automobile and walks over to him, followed by Edwin. When Dominic and his crew show up, the celebrations can officially start. Dominic sets up a single race for the evening that costs $2,000 to enter. Brian says he will give his Eclipse the pink slip even if he does not have the money to enter the race. The alley empties as everyone leaves for the road following Jesse's inspection of Brian's vehicle and the other competitors' approval for Brian to compete in the race. Dominic, Brian, Edwin, and a 4th competitor line up side by side for a quarter-mile winner-take-all race as everyone arrives on a 4-lane road. One of Dominic's companions, Leon, keeps an eye on the LAPD's scanner for any indication that their unlawful conduct has caught their attention. Hector starts the race when it is safe to do so. Although Brian had a slow start, he finally caught up to the group. He activates his nitrous system halfway through the race and passes everyone but Dominic. He uses the nitrous again toward the finish of the race, causing the floorboard to come loose, yet he still manages to pass Dominic. As the race approaches the finish line, Dominic activates his own concealed nitrous system on his Mazda RX-7 after seeing Brian's Eclipse overtake him. Dominic easily defeats Brian. Dominic is declared the winner after the race is over, making fun of Brian's amateur racing manner in front of everyone. The LAPD's request for help in pursuing the street racers is then intercepted by Leon. The group then disperses when Leon informs Hector. By hiding his RX-7 in a nearby parking garage and attempting to flee the rest of the way on foot, Dominic, his squad, and Brian are able to escape in time. However, Dominic is told to halt by an LAPD patrol car after it spots him. When the cop is about to catch Dominic as he runs through an alley, Brian stops him and tells him to get into his car. After outrunning the officer, Brian drives Dominic to safety. Brian and Dominic are ordered to follow a gang of bikers when they arrive shortly after. Johnny Tran is their leader. The two are brought to an abandoned parking lot after accidentally entering Tran's domain, Little Saigon. After they arrive in the parking lot, Tran and his cousin Lance Nguyen confront Brian and Dominic, with Tran asking why Dominic had broken their truce to keep off each other's property. Dominic blamed Brian, his new mechanic, for the accident, saying that he got lost. After Tran and Lance have finished admiring Brian's car, their gang leaves. Brian is never Dominic's mechanic, but given the situation they are in, that has to be said, even if that means losing Brian's car. Tran and Lance then come back, pull out submachine guns, start the nitrous tanks on fire, and blow up the car. Then Brian and Dominic start walking away. The two share a taxi back to Dominic's house, where Brian says farewell to Dominic, but as Dominic is about to step inside his house, where an after-party is going on, he invites Brian to join it. Brian is not well received by Dominic's team, with Vince asking Dom why he brought the buster to the party and Dominic replying that it was the buster that kept him out of handcuffs. Dominic leaves with his girlfriend Letty, and tensions mount when Brian is left alone with Vince, Leon, and Jesse. However, Mia interrupts and pulls Brian away from the trio to join her for a drink in the kitchen. She points out to Brian that her brother Dominic likes him and that it is unusual. If it's unusual for Dominic to like Brian, that's because Brian might have a positive aura, or because Dominic is also taking the time to know what Brian really wants and who he is. Brian gets arrested the following day after being stopped by an unmarked police vehicle. When the car arrives at a house, Brian is unbuckled and let out, revealing that his arrest was a fake in case he was being followed and that he is, in reality, an undercover police officer. According to Sergeant Tanner, the residence where he was taken is a former residence of Elizabeth Taylor that Eddie Fisher purchased for her in the 1950s and has since been transformed into a base of operations by an LAPD or FBI task force. Tanner and FBI Special Agent Bilkins will receive the intelligence that Brian has obtained from him. He states that he needs more time but doesn't currently have any, to which Bilkins responds that they are out of time. Brian comes to Dominic's store the following day in a tow truck with a totaled Toyota Supra, before Dominic pops the hood and discovers that the majority of the components under the hood are in decent order. His team and he laugh at the automobile, failing to see its potential. Dominic expects Brian to make up the deficit from the first race at Race Wars, a sizable legal street racing event, so Brian and his team get to work fixing the car and getting it ready for that. In the meantime, Brian and Mia form a closer bond until it culminates in Mia asking Brian out to upset Vince and her own interests. Prior to the date, Dominic takes Brian aside and drives him to his house, where he reveals in the garage a pristine 1970 Dodge Charger RT. Dominic educates Brian on the car's backstory, saying that his dad used to race and that it was a source of father-son bonding for them. However, one day a driver named Kenny Linder clipped his father's bumper during a race and caused his dad to crash into a wall at 120 miles per hour, which caused the fuel tanks to rupture and his father to burn to death. Dominic says the next time he saw Linder, he had a wrench in his hand and hit him once. He continued to hit him until he couldn't lift his arms when he was done. Dominic was subsequently banned for life from the racetracks, and Linder could never drive again. On their date later that evening, Brian and Mia talk about themselves, Dominic, and the team. They return to where Brian was staying in the office's rear room after taking a late-night drive to the beach. While they are sharing a bed, Brian's cell phone rings. Sergeant Tanner is secretly calling Brian to let him know that the truck hijackers have struck once more and that Bilkins has decided to focus the investigation on Johnny Tran and his gang as the most likely culprits. After confirming, Brian hangs up. Tran, Lance, and the rest of his gang were handed arrest warrants for the semi-truck hijackings the following day by the LAPD and FBI at the same time. Tran and his crew were not found to be the culprits of the crime, however, as all of the electronic equipment they owned had been legitimately acquired. Bilkins, Tanner, and Brian came to the conclusion that Dominic and his team are actually the culprits as a result of this outcome. After the Tran collision, Brian and Dominic are going to test the recently finished Supra. They race it against a Ferrari F355 Spider on the Pacific Coast Highway, with the Supra easily outperforming the Ferrari. After the race, Dominic and Brian have lunch and talk business as Brian pulls into the parking lot of a crab shack on the shore. With time working against him, Brian becomes increasingly hostile toward Dominic, asking how he makes all of his money, since it is obvious that he does not make it all by selling groceries and performing tune-ups. Dominic gives Brian a quick glance before handing him a sheet of paper with directions to Race Wars and telling him they'll chat more later. What is Brian thinking? Does he think Dominic will just give out sensitive information about his business and how he makes his money? But will Dominic really tell him about his business as promised? Brian shows up at Race Wars with the squad already there. Shortly after arriving, he discovers Jesse preparing to compete against Tran for pink slips, despite the fact that Tran's Honda S2000 is far faster than Jess's Volkswagen Jetta. Despite this, Jesse engages Tran, and when he prematurely activates his nitrous system, it is clear that he is a novice. He lets his guard down, believing he has the advantage, and Johnny uses his nitrous to savagely pull past Jesse for the victory. Jesse immediately leaves Race Wars in a panic. Tran pulls up next to Dominic and his group of friends and startles Dominic by ordering him to collect his car from Jesse. When Tran tells Dominic about the police raid and accuses him of being the snitch who triggered it, Dominic initially denies the allegation. Tran is sent to the ground by a punch to the jaw from Dominic, who spins around. He then gets on top of the rider and begins beating him until 2 Race Wars security guards pull him off. Later that evening, Brian goes in search of Mia and sees her arguing with Dominic outside their trailer through the window. Dom and the group leave after the argument, and Mia returns angry. In an effort to persuade her to help, Brian persistently asks her why she is unhappy and where the team is headed before finally confessing that he is a police officer and that Dominic and the team might be in danger. The look on Mia's face after hearing Brian is really disappointing, but for the sake of the love that she already has for Brian, she has to comply. Moreover, she needs to save her brother. In his Supra, Brian and Mia leave Race Wars in search of the team. In an effort to track Dominic's cell phone and catch them before they steal another truck, Brian dials a police hotline while posing as an officer. The team arrives at a remote site outside of Thermal, California, where the Honda Civics were being stashed, and prepares them for the job. They depart the site and head down a small 2-lane highway after a semi-truck. The gang forms up in the same position as at the start of the movie, but this time, as Vince jumps atop the truck driver fires multiple shotgun rounds in his direction. After numerous failed attempts to devise a rescue, Vince ends up entangled in his own grappling rope on the side of the truck, pressed up against an exhaust pipe. After the truck driver successfully disables Letty's and Dominic's automobiles, and it appears that Vince is doomed, Brian and Mia arrive on the scene and pull off a daring rescue while the truck driver reloads his shotgun, narrowly avoiding Brian getting shot in the head. The 3 eventually catch up with Brian and Mia, who have dragged Vince out of the car and onto the field as they attempt to treat his wounds. In Dominic's presence, Brian calls for an ambulance to save Vince's life after being given an unpleasant ultimatum. As the paramedics load Vince into a helicopter, Dominic, Mia, and Brian return to the car and head back to the city. Brian tries to get Dominic, who is carrying a shotgun, to put it down. Dominic orders Mia to lead the argument as she tries to intervene. Jess returns to Dominic's home when Brian and Dominic are shouting, profusely apologizing for his errors. Brian and Dominic hear dirt bikes coming up behind Jesse as he describes the scenario. They open fire on Dominic's home during a drive-by shooting, just missing Don but fatally wounding Jesse. While Mia and Dominic are inconsolable over Jesse's passing, Brian fires a couple shots at the 2 bikers before hopping into the Supra and pursuing them. Dominic jumps into the Dodge Charger in a fit of wrath and follows Tran and Lance as well. Brian follows Tran and Lance closely until Lance positions himself behind Brian in an effort to get a kill shot. The anger in Dominic only makes him want to avenge the death of Jesse. Brian continues to pursue Tran until they arrive at the overpass. At that point, Brian turns his car around and fires at Tran, hitting him twice in the left side of the ribs. This causes Tran to fall over, hit the curb, and crash, killing him. Brian notices Dominic waiting for him at the top of the hill as he examines Tran's body. After yelling for someone to dial 911, Brian quickly gets in his car and pursues after Dominic, eventually catching up with him at a stop sign. Dominic explains to Brian that he used to race there when he was in high school and that the railroad crossing up ahead is a quarter mile from where they are at the traffic light. Dominic accelerated when the light turned green, forcing the Charger to wheelie for a distance before coming to a stop. Brian could hardly keep up with the Charger's raw power, but after turning on his nitrous, he was able to close the distance. The 2 kept running despite the railroad crossing guards descending as a train approached. They were now competing with a train. In order to stay up with the Charger and maybe outrun the train, Brian engaged a second dose of nitrous oxide. The 2 launched across the railroad tracks, just avoiding the train as the race drew to a close. The 2 exhaled in relief as the race appeared to be over. When Dominic turned to face the road, he only saw a semi-truck beginning to turn onto a side street. Dominic told Brian that that's not what he had in mind for a race as Brian slammed on the brakes and hurried to his side. Thankfully, the Charger's roll cage prevented him from suffering further damage. Dominic emerged from the Charger's wreckage while police and rescue personnel were heading to the area. Brian acknowledged that he owed Dominic a 10-second vehicle from the first race and gave him the keys to the Supra while maintaining an understanding look on his face. Dominic gave a quick nod before taking the keys to the Supra and leaving before the police arrived. Brian swung around to face the approaching LAPD. After the credits, a lovely sun is shining over an incredibly blue ocean. Driving a 1970 Chevrolet Chevelle Estes in Baja, Mexico, Dominic says the well-known phrase that was featured earlier in the movie. "I move 1/4 mile at a time throughout my life. I'm free for those 10 or less seconds." Dominic then quickly veers out into the distance. Despite his bad deeds, Brian couldn't turn Dominic over to the police. This proves that their relationship matured over time, and his hands are now tied. Thanks for watching another Essential Recap. Please like and subscribe, and leave a comment what you'd like to see next.